Hello, everyone. This is Tom Fox back again with Matt Kelly for another episode of the award winning Compliance Into the Weeds. I think we're going to go deep into the weeds today because we're going to take a look at an enforcement action involving R. Donnelley. With that set up, Matt, you want to tell us why this case is so fascinating?
It is, Tom. RR Donnelley is a formerly publicly traded company that once upon a time did printing services for companies. When you had to have every exacting detail right for your 10K or 10Q filing, and you had to print it on paper and give it to the SEC by hand, RR Donnelley was one of the go-to printers. Now, since we've moved into the electronic era, so has Donnelley. It is now more a purveyor of marketing services. Some of that still related to 10Ks and 10Qs you're providing, but the other services as well. And up until I think it was 2022, RR Donnelley was publicly traded and therefore subject to SEC jurisdiction. And last month in mid-June, the SEC sanctioned RR Donnelley for a cyber breach the company experienced in November 2021, where hackers broke in. We can talk about how and what they did later on, but stole some corporate customer data, including confidential data, eventually posted it onto the dark web for sale. But the SEC faulted Donnelley for poor disclosure controls and procedures, that it didn't tell investors that it had experienced the attack in a timely manner. And then this, Tom, this also is interesting. This really is, there's two different lanes of very interesting here, is that the SEC used its enforcement powers for internal control for accounting and financial reporting to impose a sanction for poor cybersecurity controls, because this was all about poor access control, which then allowed hackers to manipulate the assets, which were Donnelley's IT systems. And if you read the Exchange Act and the relevant rules that flow therefrom, you are supposed to have effective internal control that governs how your assets are accessed, and are they used in conjunction with management's wishes. So the SEC was using an internal accounting control clause to enforce Donnelley for poor cybersecurity, when Donnelley experienced no actual accounting fraud and did not actually suffer any, I believe, no material damage. Like, it didn't lose any intellectual property. No data was stolen. It was only copied. This is a cybersecurity breach. This is a ransomware attack, data theft, pure and simple. And yet somehow the accounting provisions of the Exchange Act are the vehicle for the SEC to enforce against a cyber issue. Ultimately, Donnelley wound up paying $2.1 million, which is not a whole lot of money, but it demonstrates a precedence that the SEC has now set here, that it might use internal accounting provisions of the Exchange Act to enforce your faulty cybersecurity programs and your disclosure thereof, and even just how the attack happened. I'll stop there, but I think it's a fascinating case, first of its kind I've seen.
Matt, I guess, first of all, your analysis is incredibly sophisticated, and I either don't feel the need to go that far or see it in a different direction, because the second two prongs of the text of the Exchange Act are access to assets is permitted only according to management authorization. And then that was three. And the four is recorded accountability for assets is reconciled with existing assets. And I guess I saw some type of access to assets without management authorization, even if that was copying information. And it seemed to me, I don't want to say straightforward, but if we look at what was taken as an asset, even if it was held by a third party, this violates the text of the exchange. I'm not sure that's the road you went down, but it seemed to me that was the analysis I read into it.
It's interesting, Tom, because I agree with you and I don't. And even in the phrasing you just said, that the asset the hackers took, let's remember, they didn't take anything. Everything that Donnelley had before the attack, they still had, because it's not like they take data and then you don't get it anymore. It's that you either they copy data and sell it on the dark web, or occasionally they might lock out access to the data unless you pay them money. But it's not the same as, say, accounting fraud of 60 years ago, where somebody would come in and take the money and then leave, and like the money's not there, or some sort of inventory fraud where the inventory isn't in the warehouse. That's not what happened here. What happened here is really just a straightforward cybersecurity attack. We have those all the time. And I guess on one hand, I'm questioning, when did the SEC become a regulator to sanction you just for having a cybersecurity attack? Because that's what they did. They said you didn't have the right access controls. And so because of that, you suffered a cybersecurity attack. I thought that might be the purview of, say, the Federal Trade Commission or a state attorney general, or potentially even, you might get slapped around by CISA, which is the closest thing we have to a cybersecurity regulator, although they don't have enforcement powers. But, traditionally, the Exchange Act was about accounting fraud, and there wasn't any accounting fraud. There wasn't any money stolen. Were assets used improperly? Yes, they were. But even then, I'm still stuck on what was the actual asset, because a lot of times the access to the asset, the financial system or your data warehouse, like, you don't even own the warehouse, you don't own the system. You might rent it from a cloud provider. The only asset really that the company had was its access controls and its data, and they flubbed that up and they suffered a cyber breach. And I get it, that stinks. And maybe if they were reckless, they should have been suffering some sort of enforcement and sanction. But is that the SEC's job? Because I thought it was about investor protection and capital markets. And I'll stop there and let you respond. Although we should remember that there's also the disclosure issue of what they did tell investors, and I'm more on the SEC's side there. But this internal accounting controls as a vehicle to enforce a cybersecurity breach, I'm still wondering how street legal that is, or how it feels, because it does feel weird to me.
Let me go into the weeds on that a little bit because you used a couple of different words. You used the word take, as in nothing was taken. You used the word quote used end quote, as in the bad guys used the data of RR Donnelley. But that's not what the Exchange Act says. It says access to access is to assets is permitted only according to management authorization. And I guess it's that access to assets that I see violated, not that something was taken or not taken, not that something was used or not used, not even something was copied or not copied. And that may seem harsh, but that's been in the Exchange Act for multiple years. And it's just, when I read that in your blog post, it seemed to me to be a quite logical extension of the SEC's authority.
I guess I'm still feeling more like this is a case where the crime is outpacing the regulation and the law's ability to address it. Because really what we are getting at here is that the access controls to the corporate jewels are the same, whether we define the corporate jewels as money and accounting fraud, or data that hackers might copy and then resell on the dark web. And Tom, you and I have talked about this before, is that I have heard some thought-provoking people out there say that really your cybersecurity and your anti-money laundering functions might as well be the same. Because whether the hacker is stealing money or data, it is an improper electronic transaction. And you don't even necessarily have to worry that much about how did they get in. It sucks that they got in, but your real fear is they can't take it out. And we're still unclear on what the it is. It might be a unauthorized wire transfer, or it might be an unauthorized data dump onto some server out in, I don't know, Kazakhstan or something like that. But the access controls to protect against that and the mechanism to commit the crime, they're all the same. I see where the SEC could use an accounting provision to enforce against cybersecurity, but I'm still stuck on the point that, like, I don't know that's the SEC's job. All they did was enforce against R. Donnelley for having poor cybersecurity. Now, you want to enforce against them for having poor disclosure about what the breach was, and we still need to get back to that. That's one thing. But if R. Donnelley had really poor cybersecurity that exposed customer data, like, I've written, I don't know, a dozen, 2 dozen Federal Trade Commission enforcement actions on that. Isn't that what the FTC does? Shouldn't they have handed that off to the SEC, to the FTC? And I don't know, maybe yes, maybe no. My point is just that, like I said before, I think the crime is accelerating beyond the reach of the regulatory framework and the legal structure here to have a sensible enforcement mechanism.
I would certainly agree with that part. Let's move on to the disclosure. What did you see that caused you pause in the disclosure or lack thereof?
This gets interesting, and we have to go through exactly what the attack was. As I said, it happened at the end of November 2021, where the hackers gained access to Donnelley's systems. Now, Donnelley did have a cybersecurity consulting monitoring firm on retainer that was monitoring for intrusions. That provider found the intrusion and told Donnelley's IT security team, guys, you have an intrusion. You should look into this. Over the next 4 weeks, according to the SEC's settlement order, the intrusion monitoring vendor provided 20 alerts to the Donnelley IT security team, including one that said that they had, I want to get the exact nature of it here. One of the alerts was that the hackers had taken over a piece of equipment known as a domain controller server. That is a big deal in IT security. That is something that should cause the CISO to freak out. Basically, it means a hacker has free reign over your systems. It can gain access to a lot of other systems and a lot of other data. And all this was happening. And the IT security team at Donnelley was trying to do it, but they were overworked. They were undermanned. They didn't have a lot going on here. They weren't able really to address it and contain it. And the other thing that they did not do, apparently, was disclose the nature of this threat upward from the IT security team to the senior executives, including those in charge of disclosure outward. What really got things going was when a third party, my guess is an RR Donnelley customer, called up Donnelley's CISO to say, I think there's something weird going on here. And as soon as the CISO knew that, which was right around Christmas of 2021, all sorts of stuff started to happen. Everybody freaks out. They slam down access to the domain controller. They filed a requisite breach notification to various regulators. Like, everything happened properly once the CISO was informed and got involved. But the CISO wasn't alerted to this internally. He was alerted to it from an outside party. I suspect the customer, I might be wrong, but some outsider tipped off the CISO, you have a problem, you should look into it. Only then did everything sweep into motion and investors were notified, when it had already been going on for 4 weeks. Yet again, and I think I've mentioned this on prior podcasts, we have 2 dimensions of disclosure that companies need to keep in mind. One is disclosure out from the management team to the investing world, so investors know what the risks are. But the other is disclosure upward from the team doing the stuff to the senior executives. And that is not what happened at Donnelley, apparently. That's where the SEC had a big problem. And we have seen that before. That dysfunction is at the root of the SEC's lawsuit against SolarWinds and its CISO, because SolarWinds had been disclosing outward in the late 2010s that everything's great. We take our software development very seriously. When inside, down at the bottom, all of the IT security people were saying, that's a joke. We all know that's not happening. All these promises we're making in our security statement that we post to investors, we don't actually do that. And there was discussion at the bottom that either SolarWinds CISO didn't hear or he turned a blind eye to it. And that is the nature of the lawsuit, which, by the way, SolarWinds is defending against. But same sort of dysfunction, different company, RR Donnelley, different sort of a thing, a smaller cyber attack. But we've seen this in other ways before, too. We've seen companies sanctioned for poor disclosure of corporate culture risks. That was Activision Blizzard, which paid, I think, upward of $30 million because they had been disclosing out to investors, everything's fine, we take our workforce very seriously. And yet down at the bottom levels, Activision Blizzard people were saying, we are suffering harassment and sexual assault all the time. How did that not get disclosed upward and then outward? It's this up and out sort of chain of disclosure that the SEC wants to see about all sorts of stuff. And when people joke that, everything can be securities fraud these days, that's what it means. It means that management is either sitting on something bad and not telling investors, or they don't know that they're sitting on something bad because the disclosure processes aren't bringing the bad up to senior management to be able to tell investors. And the SEC seems to be bringing enforcement actions across a wide range of potential issues. RR Donnelley is just the latest. And I don't have any problem with that and this cybersecurity enforcement action. I'm still not sure how I feel about the internal accounting provisions being used for cybersecurity programs. But, at least on the disclosure controls, I think that's a real thing, and compliance and audit teams have to keep an eye on it.
Matt, you concluded your blog post with a section that I'm going to call the multiverse, because when I read it, that's what it reminded me of. And essentially, you asked, does a CISO have control over a company's financial technology, or are definition of reasonable assurance under the Exchange Act such that the CFO or the financial department would have control over the financial technology in the internal control so that there was some sort of reasonable assurance that either there wouldn't be a cyber attack or that there would be notice of it going forward. Maybe I've got that right. Maybe it's more sophisticated than I thought, but it seemed to me to be an incredibly complex question or set of questions you posed in your final section.
I think it's actually, I would say it's more like a very slippery slope that the SEC is putting forward here. So you need to have reasonable assurance with your internal controls that assets are being accessed properly according to management's wishes. They're being reconciled against actual assets and all these other criteria. Reasonable assurance. What does that actually mean? The statute does spell it out, is that they are assurances and precautions you would take, a reasonable person would take in their own prudent affairs. I don't remember the exact phrase that I have there, but how prudent you would be in your own affairs. Now think about what that means. If you've already suffered a cyber attack, then you are going to be more prudent about the assurance you want because you know it can happen to you. And I've talked about this before too. Imagine that you have a 17-year-old who wants to borrow the car and you tell them no, and they borrow it anyways. Now that you know they take the car without your permission, you are going to impose more internal controls over your 17-year-old and maybe never give them the keys at all, or maybe ground them. I don't know what. But it's the same sort of thing. It's also true in FCPA world, in case anybody wanted us to bring that dimension into this as well. Once you suffer the failure, you can't you can't unsee the fact that you've had that failure. And so now a reasonable person would want to be even more prudent in their affairs and the internal controls they have, so this won't happen again. Well, everybody under the sun has had a cybersecurity attack at this point. Many different companies have suffered FCPA violations, or we could say that you've had some sort of a privacy breach, even if compliance officers aren't CISOs directly. You're wondering, what does this have to do with me? If you worry about privacy compliance, if that's part of your purview, you could worry about it that way. So if the SEC is telling companies that it's going to use the internal accounting provisions to start enforcing against non-accounting things, because really it's just about access control. Access to what? Once the outsider is in, it doesn't matter. It's all just electronic data and they're going to grab it, whether it's financial data or, I don't know, some sort of corruption of your third-party vendors. So you're going to commit a bribery scheme, or it's a privacy breach or whatnot. Somebody else said that this enforcement action demonstrates that the internal accounting provisions are like the Swiss Army knife of SEC enforcement. And I think that's very true. It's a very good phrase, that if the SEC could use these internal accounting provisions to enforce against just about any type of compliance violation, how are you going to defend against that? Because it fundamentally requires strong cybersecurity. That's not in the compliance officer's purview. It is in the CISO's purview, but they don't necessarily know all the potential compliance violations that might flow from poor access control and now they're in your system doing whatever. So would the CISO need to be educated on that? Would they have more authority over what technology you actually use? Would your IT team get to look at access controls and start invalidating certain processes because the access controls are too weak? There's a lot that could flow from this that could lead to some very strict internal controls. And look, I'm a big fan of strong internal controls, but I don't know that a lot of companies have fully grasped the implications of that. And now the Donnelley case comes along showing you here's why you should try and sit down and grasp them, because they can be quite thorny and come at you from different directions.
Matt, unfortunately, we're near the end of our time for this episode, but we're going to link to your blog post in the show notes. I can't wait to see what next week brings us.
Thank you, Tom.